The ice chisel slipped from Daniel Harris's frozen fingers and clattered against the steel deck of the SS Gemstone. It was 05:37 hours on September 29, 1941, and the 21-year-old able seaman from Liverpool had been trying for 20 minutes to clear frost from the forward lookout station. His hands, even through wool gloves, had gone numb. The wind off Valfjord came at him like knives, salt-laced, bitter, carrying the smell of engine oil and the deeper cold of the Arctic that waited somewhere beyond Iceland's northern coast. Harris bent to retrieve the chisel, and that's when he saw them. 10 more ships scattered across the gray water of the fjord, engines idling, hulls sitting low and heavy. Smoke drifted from their stacks in ragged columns that the wind tore apart before it could rise. British merchantmen mostly, a few flying Panamanian colors, one Belgian. He didn't know their names yet. By the time this voyage ended, he'd know every silhouette by heart, the way soldiers knew the faces of men they'd bled beside. Down in Gemstone's hold, chained to reinforced deck plates, sat 4 Matilda tanks. 20 more were distributed among the other ships. Crated Hurricane fighters filled the remaining cargo space. 193 aircraft packed in wooden boxes stamped with Cyrillic lettering Harris couldn't read. Ammunition, medical supplies, raw materials, everything the Soviet Union needed to survive another week against the German onslaught that had been grinding eastward since June 22nd. Harris had heard stories about what was happening in Russia. Wehrmacht panzers at the gates of Leningrad. Moscow threatened. Entire Soviet armies encircled and destroyed. The BBC said Stalin was asking, no, begging for help. And now Harris and 1,000 other merchant sailors were being sent into the Arctic to deliver it. The problem was simple and terrifying. Nobody knew if it could be done. On the bridge of HMS Suffolk, Commander Philip Quellen Roberts studied charts that ended in white space marked ice conditions unknown and magnetic compass unreliable north of 70 degrees. The heavy cruiser would escort this convoy, designated PQ-1 from Roberts' own initials, though he'd learn that detail only later, alongside the destroyer HMS Impulsive and 4 Halcyon-class minesweepers, Britomart, Leda, Hussar, and Gossamer. Roberts was 38 years old, a career officer who'd spent 2 decades learning naval warfare in the Mediterranean and Atlantic. Everything he knew about convoy protection, stay in deep water, maintain speed, concentrate defensive fire, would be useless here. The Arctic route to Arkhangelsk was 2,000 miles through seas where water temperature hovered at 34 Fahrenheit, where ice could tear a hull open, and where German air bases in Norway sat less than 200 miles from the convoy's track. Worse, there were no established anchorages, no rescue stations, no charts showing safe channels through the ice pack that was already advancing south as winter approached. The Admiralty had drawn a line on a map and told him to make it work. If PQ-1 succeeded, more convoys would follow. If it failed, if U-boats found them, if Luftwaffe bombers caught them in daylight, if the weather simply killed them, the entire Arctic supply route would be written off as impossible. Roberts checked his watch. 0615 hours. 15 minutes until departure. He looked at his executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Ashford, who was reviewing the weather report with an expression that said everything. Temperature dropping to 28 degrees Celsius by tonight. Ice edge 400 miles north of Bear Island and moving south daily. Visibility poor to 0. Gale force winds expected within 48 hours. Roberts nodded. Signal the convoy. Form columns. Course 090. Speed 7 knots. Maintain radio silence except for emergencies. Aye, sir. And if we encounter German forces? Roberts looked back at the map, at the narrow funnel between the ice pack and Nazi-occupied Norway, at the 2,000 miles of black water ahead. Then we find out if Churchill's promise to Stalin is worth more than paper. At 6:30 hours, the first ship weighed anchor. Atlantic, British flagged, 5,200 tons, carrying tanks and ammunition. Her bow swung toward open water as her crew scrambled to secure lines and clear ice from the deck rails. One by one, the others followed. Blairnevis, Elna II, Harmonic, Lorca, River Afton, the fleet oiler Black Ranger. Gemstone nearly didn't sail at all. Her crew, 37 men who'd signed on thinking they'd run supplies to Gibraltar, not the Arctic, had refused to board until extra blankets were delivered. The ship's agent in Reykjavik had to strip bedding from a hotel to meet the demand. Harris had watched crates of wool blankets being loaded at 0500 hours while the captain stood on deck, face red with fury and cold, shouting about mutiny and cowardice. But the blankets came, and Gemstone sailed, because every man aboard knew what refusing meant: court-martial, prison, disgrace. And beneath that fear lay something else, a thin strand of duty that kept men moving even when logic screamed to stay in port. By 800 hours, all 10 merchant ships were clear of Hvalfjord and formed into 3 ragged columns. HMS Suffolk took position 4,000 yards ahead. Impulsive patrolled the left flank. The 4 minesweepers spread across the convoy's rear like sheepdogs. Their crews, fishermen 6 months ago, sailors now, scanning the horizon for periscopes that could appear at any moment. Harris stood his watch on Gemstone's bow, binoculars pressed to his eyes, seeing nothing but gray water merging into gray sky. The cold crept through his coat, through his sweater, through his skin until it felt like his bones were made of ice. Every hour another man would relieve him, and Harris would stumble below deck to the crew quarters, where a tiny stove burned coal and 30 men crowded around it like worshippers at an altar. Nobody talked much. Words seemed dangerous, as if speaking would attract the attention of whatever waited in the dark. The first night passed without incident, but sleep was impossible. The ship rolled in long, heavy swells that came from the northwest, Arctic water, pushed by winds that had traveled across 1,000 miles of emptiness. Men wedged themselves into bunks to avoid being thrown out. The sound of the engine, normally a steady throb, became erratic as the propeller lifted clear of the waves and screamed before biting water again. Harris lay in his bunk, eyes open, listening to the groan of steel under stress. Somewhere in the hold below, the Matilda tanks shifted against their chains. He wondered what would happen if one broke loose in heavy seas, if 4 tons of steel started sliding across the cargo deck, smashing through bulkheads, tearing holes in the hull. He wondered if they'd have time to abandon ship, or if the Arctic would simply swallow them in minutes. On the second day, fog closed in, thick, white, impenetrable. Visibility dropped to less than 100 yards. Ships became ghosts, visible only as dark smudges against the murk. HMS Impulsive fired signal rockets every 30 minutes to maintain formation, bright streaks that arced through the fog and died before hitting water. In the wireless room, the operator monitored frequencies in absolute silence. Radio discipline was total. One transmission could give the convoy's position to German direction-finding stations in Norway. So the ship sailed blind and mute, each captain navigating by dead reckoning and prayer, hoping the fog would lift before collision or grounding made the entire mission pointless. Harris's messmate, a Welsh stoker named Owen, spoke the thought everyone shared. "We're sailing through the devil's arsehole, mate, and he hasn't noticed us yet." By day 3, they'd crossed 68 Adegrain latitude. The sun, when it appeared through breaks in the fog, barely rose above the horizon. Twilight stretched across 20 hours. Men began losing track of time, sleeping when exhaustion forced them, waking to darkness that could mean midnight or noon. Meals were eaten standing, backs pressed to bulkheads for warmth. Salt pork, black bread that tasted like sawdust, tea the color of rust, sweetened with condensed milk. Harris ate mechanically, tasting nothing, thinking only about staying warm enough to function. On the bridge of HMS Suffolk, Commander Roberts watched the barometer drop and knew what was coming. At 14:30 hours on October 1st, the wind hit. It came from the north, Arctic wind carrying sleet that hit like buckshot. Within minutes, visibility dropped to 0. The sea transformed from rolling swells into mountains of black water that climbed 30 feet and crashed across the convoy with enough force to tear lifeboats from their davits. HMS Impulsive vanished into a wave trough and disappeared for 10 seconds before her bow erupted from the crest, water pouring off her deck in white torrents. The merchantmen, slower and heavier, wallowed through the storm like drunks. Gemstone took a wave over the bow that smashed Harris against a bulkhead and nearly swept him overboard. He clung to a stanchion, gasping, feeling ribs that might be cracked, tasting blood where he'd bitten his tongue. For 6 hours, the storm hammered them. Men below deck were thrown from bunks. Cargo shifted. In the engine room of the Panamanian ship Capira, a steam line ruptured, scalding 2 crew members and threatening to shut down the engines entirely. Her chief engineer, a German émigré named Schmidt, who'd fled Hamburg in 1936, worked in 140 degrees heat with a wrench and prayer, sealing the leak with his hands blistering inside work gloves. When the wind finally eased at 2100 hours, Roberts ordered a signal lamp count. 10 ships responded, all still afloat, all still moving. But North King, the Belgian vessel, reported engine trouble. Her chief engineer had gotten the machinery running again, but she was falling behind, dropping 2,000 yards astern of the convoy. Roberts faced a choice: slow the entire convoy and risk exposing everyone to attack, or leave North King to catch up on her own, unescorted, vulnerable. He ordered the convoy to reduce speed to 6 knots. Every man aboard knew what that decision meant: more time in the killing zone, more hours exposed to U-boats and aircraft. But you didn't leave a ship behind, not in the Arctic. Not when falling overboard meant 5 minutes until hypothermia made your limbs useless, 10 minutes until your heart stopped beating. On October 2nd at 13:47 hours, the Focke-Wulf Condor appeared. Harris saw it first, a dark cross against gray sky, flying at 8,000 feet, circling the convoy in a wide, lazy pattern. The 4-engine reconnaissance bomber stayed well out of anti-aircraft range, observing, counting ships, noting course and speed. Every man on every deck watched it with a sick certainty. The Germans knew they were here now. Roberts expected the attack to come within hours. U-boats would converge from bases in Norway. Heinkel bombers would launch at dawn. The convoy would be bracketed, hunted, destroyed piecemeal in the narrow waters between the ice and the Norwegian coast. But nothing happened. The Condor circled for 40 minutes, then turned south and disappeared. Sunset came, what passed for sunset at 70 degrees, and the convoy sailed on through darkness. Midnight. 0200 hours, 0400, no torpedoes, no bombs. Just the endless rolling of black water and the frost forming on every exposed surface. Harris didn't understand it. Neither did anyone else. They'd been spotted. German naval intelligence knew convoy PQ-1 existed, knew its route, knew its weakness. Yet the attack never came. What Harris couldn't know, what none of them could know, was that German high command didn't believe the Arctic convoys mattered. 10 ships carrying supplies to a nation the Wehrmacht expected to defeat within weeks. It wasn't worth diverting U-boats from the Atlantic or bombers from raids on Britain. Let the British waste fuel and ships on a futile gesture. Let the Arctic Ocean kill them instead. That miscalculation would cost Germany the war. But in October 1941, it saved PQ-1. On October 6th, they crossed 70 degrees, the murder latitude, as the crew of Gemstone had started calling it. Here, the distance between the ice pack to the north and German bases to the south narrowed to less than 300 miles. A U-boat could reach them in hours, aircraft in minutes. There was nowhere to hide, no safe channel, no rescue if something went wrong. Harris stood his watch and saw icebergs for the first time. Massive white shapes drifting south, some as large as buildings, calved from glaciers in Svalbard and carried by currents into the shipping lanes. HMS Suffolk steered the convoy around them, adding miles to the journey, but avoiding collisions that could rip a hull open faster than any torpedo. On October 8th, Soviet destroyers appeared from the east, 2 ships flying the red flag, their bows pushing through light ice as they approached the convoy. Russian officers came aboard HMS Suffolk with charts of the approaches to Arkhangelsk, shared intelligence about German air activity, spoke in halting English about the siege of Leningrad and the desperate need for tanks, ammunition, anything. Roberts asked how long the Soviets could hold. The Russian captain, a man named Kuznetsov, face weathered and eyes exhausted, replied simply, "With your help, perhaps until spring. Without, perhaps until Christmas." That night, Harris lay in his bunk and thought about mathematics. 11 ships carrying 20 tanks and 193 aircraft against German armies that had destroyed entire Soviet divisions in days. It seemed absurd, futile, a gesture without meaning. But then he thought about the women he'd seen in newsreels, digging anti-tank ditches outside Moscow with bare hands, about Soviet soldiers counterattacking with rifles but no ammunition, charging German machine guns because retreating meant execution, about a war being fought with desperation and blood, where 11 ships might buy enough time for a nation to survive one more week. On October 11, 1941, At 09:20 hours, the first ship of convoy PQ-1 entered Arkhangelsk Harbor, then the second, then all 11, battered, ice-covered, engines coughing black smoke, but intact. Not a single casualty, not one ship lost. Women lined the docks, thousands of them, because the men were at the front, waving, singing, crying. Cranes swung into position. The first Matilda tank rolled down a ramp onto Russian soil, its tracks clanking on concrete, and the sound echoed across the harbor like thunder. Harris stood on deck, watching, feeling nothing except cold and exhaustion and a hollow relief that he was still alive. Commander Roberts filed his after-action report. Convoy arrived intact, route feasible. Recommend increased escort for future operations. German opposition expected to intensify significantly. In Berlin, Wehrmacht intelligence noted the arrival of PQ-1 and filed the report under minor supply operations, no strategic significance. It was the last time the Germans would make that mistake. Convoy PQ-1 had opened a route that would see 78 ships sunk and 3,000 men killed before the war ended, but it had also delivered hope to a nation that had none left. And in October 1941, hope was a weapon worth dying for. The smell hit Merchant Captain Samuel Carter before he even saw the ships. Diesel fuel, coal smoke, the sharp metallic tang of fresh paint on steel hulls. It was June 26, 1942, and Hvalfjord, Iceland was crammed with 35 merchant vessels, the largest Arctic convoy ever assembled. Carter was 38 years old from Galveston, Texas, commanding the Liberty ship SS William Hooper, 7,000 tons of American-built steel, carrying 15 Sherman tanks, 200 tons of ammunition, and enough explosives in the forward hold to vaporize the ship if a torpedo found the right spot. He'd volunteered for the Arctic run because the pay was triple, $450 a month, plus a $300 bonus per completed voyage. Enough to send his wife Mary and their 2 daughters to relatives in Oklahoma, far from the coast, where German U-boats couldn't touch them. Standing on William Hooper's bridge, Carter counted hulls through binoculars. British freighters, American Liberties, one Panamanian tanker riding so low, her deck was almost awash. Every ship loaded to maximum capacity. 297 aircraft, 594 tanks, 4,046 vehicles, 156,000 tons of war material, enough to equip 20 Soviet divisions for a month. But everyone in the anchorage knew the statistics from previous convoys. PQ-16, which had sailed in May, lost 7 ships out of 35. PQ-15 in April, 3 lost. PQ-13 in March, 5 lost, including the cruiser HMS Trinidad. The Germans had learned. Luftwaffe bombers now staged from Norwegian airfields positioned perfectly to intercept convoys. U-boat wolf packs assembled in advance. And now, intelligence whispered about something worse. Tirpitz. The battleship Tirpitz, sister to the legendary Bismarck, displaced 42,900 tons, mounted 8 15-inch guns, and was protected by armor thick enough to shrug off anything except point-blank battleship fire. Churchill himself had called her the most dangerous ship in the German Navy, and German Naval Command had positioned her in Trondheim Fjord, Norway, 600 miles from the convoy route. At 1400 hours on June 27th, Commander Jack Broom, no relation to any merchant captain, a Royal Navy officer commanding destroyer HMS Keppel, assembled the merchant captains for final briefing. 35 men crowded into Keppel's wardroom, sitting on benches, leaning against bulkheads, the air thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Commander Broom didn't waste time with pleasantries. Gentlemen, German reconnaissance has had eyes on this anchorage for 3 days. They know we're sailing. They know our strength. By the time we round Bear Island, they'll have U-boats positioned across our route, bombers fueled and armed, and possibly surface raiders, including Tirpitz, waiting to intercept. Samuel Carter felt his stomach tighten. Tirpitz. Against merchant ships that carried no armor and whose top speed was 11 knots if you pushed the engines until they screamed. Our escort, Broom continued, gesturing to a map pinned to the wardroom wall, consists of 6 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 3 minesweepers, 4 armed trawlers, 2 anti-aircraft ships, and 2 submarines. Additionally, Rear Admiral Hamilton's cruiser squadron, HMS London Norfolk, and the American cruisers Tuscaloosa and Wichita will provide distant cover. One of the British captains, a gray-haired veteran named Thompson from SS Empire Byron, raised his hand. "Commander, what happens if Tirpitz comes?" Broom's expression didn't change. If German surface raiders engage, the destroyers will screen while the convoy scatters. Each ship proceeds independently to the nearest Soviet port at maximum speed. Scatters? Thompson's voice rose. You mean we run alone with no protection? The escorts will delay the enemy long enough for the convoy to disperse. After that, your survival depends on speed, weather, and luck. Samuel Carter spoke up, his Texas drawl cutting through the room's tension. Commander, with respect, a Liberty ship does 11 knots maximum. Tirpitz does 30. How exactly does running help us? Broom met his eyes. It spreads the targets, Captain Carter, makes it harder for them to kill all of you at once. Some of you will survive. The silence that followed was broken only by the creak of ship's timbers and the distant cry of gulls outside. Some of us, Thompson repeated bitterly. Gentlemen, Broom said quietly, I won't lie to you. This is the most dangerous convoy route in the war. But the Soviet Union is dying. Leningrad is starving. Moscow is threatened. Without these supplies, the Eastern Front collapses. And if Russia falls, the war is lost. Nobody argued, because everyone knew it was true. Convoy PQ-17 departed Valfjord at 1800 hours on June 27, 1942. 35 merchant ships formed into 9 columns, each column separated by 600 yards, the formation stretching across 3 miles of gray Arctic water. HMS Keppel took position ahead. Destroyers Leamington, Ledbury, Wilton, Fury, and Offa spread across the flanks. The corvettes Lotus, Poppy, Dianella, and La Malouine wove between columns, their ASDIC pinging continuously, hunting for submarine signatures. Samuel Carter stood on William Hooper's bridge wing as Iceland's mountains faded astern. The air temperature was 42 degrees, cold for July, and dropping as they steamed northeast. Around him, 34 other ships plowed forward at 8 knots, their bows throwing white spray, black smoke trailing from stacks, every vessel low and heavy with cargo, worth more than the ships carrying it. His first mate, a Mississippian named Roberts, came up beside him. Captain, crew's asking if we're really going through with this. Tell them we're delivering tanks to the Russians. They know that, sir. They're asking if we're coming back. Carter looked at Roberts, at his young face. The kid was 24 and wondered how to answer honestly without destroying morale. Tell them the convoy ahead of us lost 7 ships. That means 28 made it through. Better than 50-50 odds. Roberts nodded slowly. And Tirpitz, sir? If she comes, we scatter and run. Some of us make it. How many is some? Carter didn't answer because he didn't know. The first 3 days passed in eerie calm. Clear weather, too clear, with 24-hour Arctic daylight exposing every ship to observation from 50 miles away. The convoy maintained strict radio silence. Lookouts scanned the horizon in 4-hour watches, binoculars pressed to faces gone numb from wind chill. In the wireless rooms, operators monitored German frequencies, hearing coded transmissions they couldn't decrypt but knew meant reconnaissance reports flowing back to Norway. On July 1st, at 14:20 hours, the Focke-Wulf Condor appeared. Carter saw it through binoculars, 4 engine reconnaissance aircraft circling at 12,000 feet, well beyond anti-aircraft range. It orbited the convoy for 40 minutes, counting ships, noting course and speed, photographing the formation. When it finally turned south and disappeared, every man aboard every ship knew the Germans had found them. 26 hours later, the killing began. At 8:35 hours on July 2nd, Carter was drinking coffee on William Hooper's bridge when the Liberty ship SS Christopher Newport, steaming 800 yards to starboard, exploded. 3 torpedoes from U-456 hit her port side within 5 seconds. The first detonated in the forward hold where 500-pound bombs were stored. The blast blew Christopher Newport's bow completely off, tore it away in a shower of steel fragments and burning debris that arced through the air like meteors. The second torpedo hit amidships. The third struck the engine room. Carter felt the shockwave through his boots, a deep, concussive thump that rattled the bridge windows. He ran to the starboard wing and saw Christopher Newport settling by the bow, black smoke pouring from her shattered hull, her crew scrambling toward lifeboats as the ship folded in the middle like a book being closed. "Hard to port!" Carter shouted. "Engines full! Get us away from her!" Because a sinking ship pulls other vessels down with her through suction, and because where one U-boat fired, others were waiting. Christopher Newport sank in 4 minutes. Her crew, 57 men, went into the Arctic Ocean. Water temperature, 36 degrees Celsius. Survival time, 12 to 15 minutes before hypothermia made swimming impossible, 20 minutes before the heart stopped. HMS Ledbury raced toward the sinking site, her depth charges armed, hunting the submarine. She rescued 23 men. 34 died, their bodies floating in orange life jackets, faces blue, mouths frozen open. The convoy didn't stop. Commander Broom's orders were explicit. Maintain formation, maintain speed. Stopping meant bunching up, giving U-boats concentrated targets. So PQ-17 steamed on, leaving the dead behind. At 16:15 hours, German bombers arrived. 12 Heinkel He-111s in formation at 9,000 feet. Bomb bay doors open, black crosses visible on their wings. The convoy's anti-aircraft ships HMS Palomares and Poza Rica opened fire immediately, sending streams of 40mm and 20mm shells skyward in dirty gray bursts. The Heinkels pressed through the flak. Bombs fell in sticks, 3 per aircraft, tumbling black shapes that whistled as they dropped. Carter watched them come, watched the closest stick arc toward William Hooper, and felt his bladder let go as the bombs hit water 75 yards to port. The near miss lifted William Hooper's stern clear of the ocean. Green water flooded across the deck. A lifeboat tore loose from its davits and crashed against the superstructure. But the hull held. No penetration, no fire, still afloat. The Liberty ship SS Navarino in the next column took a direct hit. A 500-kilo bomb punched through her deck, through 2 cargo holds, and detonated against her keel. The explosion broke her spine. She folded amidships, bow and stern, rising out of the water as her center section flooded. 2 minutes later, she was gone. 31 men dead. 2 ships lost in 1 day. 33 remained. And this, Carter realized with sick certainty, was only the beginning. Over the next 2 days, the attacks intensified. U-boats shadowed continuously, transmitting position reports every 2 hours to guide bomber strikes. Luftwaffe aircraft came in waves. Heinkels in the morning, Junkers Ju-88s at midday, torpedo-armed Heinkel, He-115 seaplanes at dusk. July 3rd, no ships lost but constant attacks. The convoy twisted and turned like a hunted animal, escorts firing until ammunition ran low. July 4th, Independence Day, noted grimly by American crews. The pace escalated. At 7:30 hours, U-88 torpedoed the Soviet tanker Azerbaijan, carrying 10,000 tons of aviation fuel. She exploded in a fireball that climbed 300 feet into the Arctic sky, visible from 40 miles. All hands lost. At 11:20 hours, U-334 hit William Hooper. Carter was on the bridge when the torpedo struck, aft near the engine room. The deck heaved underneath him. Alarms screamed. He grabbed the speaking tube to the engine room and shouted, "Damage report! Static!" Then his chief engineer's voice, strained. "Captain, we're flooding. Port side aft. I can slow it, but I can't stop it." How long? Maybe 30 minutes. Maybe less. Carter looked at the gray water, at the other ships steaming on without pause, at the distant smudge of smoke from Azerbaijan still burning on the horizon. "Abandoned ship," he said quietly. "Get the crew into lifeboats. Now." By 2100 hours on July 4th, PQ-17 had lost 4 merchant ships. 29 remained, steaming at 8 knots toward Bear Island, the funnel, the narrowest point between ice pack and German-occupied Norway. Commander Broom knew the worst was yet to come. German forces were massing for a coordinated strike. Surface raiders, submarines, bombers. And in London, 1,500 miles from the Arctic, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, First Sea Lord of the Royal Navy, sat in an office reviewing ultra-intelligence decrypts that suggested Tirpitz had left Trondheim Fjord. The decrypts were wrong. Tirpitz was still in harbor, delayed by mechanical issues, but Pound didn't know that. What he knew was that if Tirpitz caught the convoy, she would annihilate the escorts and systematically destroy every merchant ship within 6 hours. At 2111 hours, Pound made his decision. Immediate cruiser force withdraw westward at high speed. Commander Broom, aboard HMS Keppel, received the signal at 2113 hours and felt his stomach drop. Withdraw the cruisers. That meant stripping the convoy of its heavy protective screen. 12 minutes later, a second message arrived. Most immediate. Convoy is to scatter. Broom stared at the signal. Scatter abandoned formation. Send 33 merchant ships, alone, unescorted, defenseless, across 400 miles of ocean swarming with U-boats and bombers. His executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Wells, read the message over his shoulder. "Sir, this is suicide. It's an order. We can't leave them. Not now. Not like this." Broom looked at Wells, at the young officer's face gone pale with the realization of what was about to happen. "If Tirpitz is coming, the escorts can't stop her. We'd die protecting the convoy, and then the convoy would die anyway. Scattering gives them a chance." "How much of a chance, sir?" Broom didn't answer because the mathematics were brutal. Isolated merchant ships, maximum speed 11 knots, facing German forces that could hunt them individually. Maybe half would survive, maybe less. At 123 hours, signal flags climbed Keppel's mast, the order to scatter, and convoy PQ-17, which had survived 4 days as a unified formation, ceased to exist. Samuel Carter clung to a piece of wreckage, timber from William Hooper's shattered lifeboat, and watched his ship die. The Liberty ship's bow rose skyward as her stern flooded, propellers spinning uselessly in open air. Her name, William Hooper Galveston, visible on the transom until the moment she slipped under and was gone. 12 men from his crew floated nearby in life jackets. His first mate Roberts was among them, lips already blue from the 36 water. Carter knew the statistics: 15 minutes until hypothermia made their limbs useless, 20 minutes until unconsciousness, 30 minutes until death. He'd been in the water for 8 minutes. "Captain!" Roberts gasped, teeth chattering. "I can't feel my legs." "Hold on," Carter said, though he knew it was futile. "Help's coming." But help wasn't coming. The escorts had withdrawn west at high speed, following orders. The merchant ships had scattered, each captain choosing his own course, his own fate. And Carter, along with 37 men from William Hooper's crew, drifted in the Arctic Ocean with no rescue in sight. At 12 minutes, Roberts stopped speaking. His eyes remained open but unseeing. His body floated, held up by the life jacket, but his spirit was gone. At 16 minutes, Carter's vision began to narrow. His hands, locked around the timber, refused to respond to commands. Cold had stopped being a sensation. He simply existed in a state beyond temperature, beyond pain, in a gray fog that promised peace if he just let go. At 19 minutes, a Soviet patrol boat found him. They pulled 11 men from the water. 37 had abandoned ship. 26 died before rescue arrived. The massacre of PQ-17 continued for 7 days. German U-boats and aircraft hunted the scattered ships individually, picking them off one by one across 500 miles of ocean. Some merchant captains tried to hide in the ice pack. Others steamed at maximum speed for the nearest Soviet port. A few formed small groups, hoping mutual protection might save them. The losses mounted with inexorable mathematics. July 5th, 8 ships sunk July 6th, 7 ships sunk July 7th, 4 ships sunk July 8th, 2 ships sunk July 9th, 1 ship sunk July 10th, 2 ships sunk, 24 merchant ships destroyed, 430 Sherman tanks lost, 210 aircraft lost, 350 vehicles lost, 99 316 tons of cargo sent to the bottom, 153 merchant seamen dead. 11 ships survived, the ones whose captains found fog to hide in, or reached Soviet coastal waters before bombers found them, or simply got lucky when torpedoes malfunctioned. They limped into Arkhangelsk between July 11th and July 25th, damaged, depleted, their crews hollow-eyed and traumatized. Tirpitz never appeared. The German battleship had sortied briefly on July 5th, but Admiral Raeder, cautious about risking his prize warship, recalled her before she reached the convoy routes. The threat that had destroyed PQ-17 had been a phantom. On August 3, 1942, in a hospital room in Murmansk, Samuel Carter sat on the edge of a bed and wrote a letter to his wife Mary in Oklahoma. His hands still shook. Hypothermia damage, the Soviet doctor said, but he forced himself to hold the pen steady. "Dear Mary, the ship is gone. I'm alive. I don't know why. 12 of us made it out of 50. The rest died in the water before rescue came. Roberts among them. He was 24. They tell me 11 ships from the convoy reached port. I don't know how many men died total. Hundreds, I think. Maybe more. All because someone in London thought a German battleship was coming when it wasn't. I'm done, Mary. I've requested transfer back to the Atlantic Run. I can't do this anymore. I can't watch good men die because someone 1,000 miles away made a bad guess. Tell the girls I love them. Tell them their daddy is coming home. Sam." He sealed the letter, addressed it, and gave it to a Soviet nurse who promised to get it on the next convoy west. Then he walked to the hospital window and looked out at Arkhangelsk Harbor. 4 merchant ships sat at anchor, unloading cargo, survivors of PQ-17. Cranes swung tanks onto the docks. Women workers sang as they hauled crates of ammunition toward waiting trains. One of those women, a girl really, maybe 19 years old, paused to wipe sweat from her face. Her husband was at Stalingrad, Carter had heard, fighting in the ruins with a rifle that jammed every 10 rounds. These tanks, these supplies, they might reach him, might keep him alive another week. 24 ships had died. Hundreds of men had died, but 11 ships had gotten through. And somewhere on the Eastern Front, a Soviet soldier who would have died tomorrow might live because of what they'd delivered. Carter didn't know if that made the losses worth it. He only knew that the alternative, sending nothing, letting Russia collapse, would have meant losing the war. He turned from the window, went back to his bed, and tried not to dream about water that was cold enough to kill, and faces frozen in death, and a convoy that scattered because someone feared a battleship that never came. The ice on HMS Onslow's bridge windows was thick enough to carve. Lieutenant Commander Robert Sherbrooke stood with his face 6 inches from frozen glass, scraping a viewing port clear with a steel chisel while outside, Arctic darkness pressed against the ship like a physical weight. It was 8:15 hours on December 31st, 1942, and somewhere in that darkness, 14 merchant ships carrying 202 tanks and 120 aircraft were steaming toward Murmansk at 8 knots. Sherbrooke commanded the close escort for convoy JW-51B, 6 destroyers against whatever the German Navy chose to throw at them. His flagship Onslow displaced 1,540 tons and mounted 4 4.7-inch guns, pop guns compared to the weapons aboard German heavy cruisers. But Sherbrooke had learned in 2 years of Arctic convoys that survival wasn't about firepower. It was about mathematics, weather, and the willingness to die if dying bought the convoy 30 more minutes to escape. The temperature outside was 18 degrees Celsius, wind force 7, gusting to force 9. Visibility 500 yards in snow squalls, dropping to 0 when the wind picked up. These were perfect conditions. Perfect because German bombers couldn't fly, because reconnaissance aircraft couldn't find the convoy, because the darkness and weather turned the Arctic into a place where only the desperate operated. Sherbrooke's executive officer, Lieutenant David Kinloch, entered the bridge carrying 2 mugs of tea that steamed in the frozen air. Met Office predicts conditions holding through tomorrow, sir. Wind increasing to force 10 by nightfall. That's excellent news, David. Kinloch handed him the tea. Sir, with respect, force 10 winds will tear boats off their davits and send green water over the bow every 30 seconds. How is that excellent? Sherbrooke sipped the tea. Black, bitter, hot enough to burn. Because German heavy cruisers don't like force 10 gales either. Admiral Hipper draws 19 feet. In these seas, she'll be taking water over her main deck. Her fire control will be compromised, her speed advantage negated. He looked at Kinloch. Bad weather is our ally. Remember that. At 8:27 hours, the radio operator appeared in the bridge doorway, face pale. Sir, obdurate reports radar contact. Surface vessel bearing 045, range 30,000 yards, large signature, possibly cruiser class. The bridge went silent except for the groan of steel under stress and the howl of Arctic wind. Sherbrooke set down his tea carefully. Sound action stations. Signal the convoy. Emergency turn to starboard. Scatter plan Delta if we give the order. All destroyers form on Onslow. Kinloch reached for the alarm, then paused. Sir, if it's Hipper, we buy the convoy time. 30 minutes minimum. That's the mission. And if we can't hold 30 minutes? Sherbrooke met his eyes. Then we die trying, and the next destroyer takes over until the convoy is clear. The action station's alarm screamed through the ship, a sound every man aboard had trained to react to instantly. Within 90 seconds, Onslow was at full combat readiness. Guns manned, damage control parties stationed, torpedo tubes trained outboard, depth charges armed. 520 men, most of them under 25 years old, waiting in the darkness for an enemy that outweighed them 5-1. At 09:30 hours, the enemy appeared. HMS Obdurate, steaming 8,000 yards ahead of the convoy, saw them first through a gap in the snow squalls. 3 German destroyers in line ahead, their bows throwing white spray, closing at 25 knots. and behind them, barely visible through the murk, the massive silhouette of a heavy cruiser, turrets rotating, searching for targets. Admiral Hipper, 14,000 tons, 8 8-inch guns, 6-inch armor belt. The most powerful surface raider in northern waters. Sherbrooke received Obdurate's contact report at 0933 hours and made the calculation instantly. Hipper could reach the convoy in 20 minutes, could destroy every merchant ship within 2 hours, unless the destroyers stopped her. All ships, this is Onslow. Form line ahead. Course 045, speed 28 knots. We're going in. Kinloch stared. Sir, we're attacking. We're screening. There's a difference. Sherbrooke pointed at the tactical plot. The convoy is here, steaming east. The Germans are here, approaching from north. We position ourselves between them. Force Hipper to engage us instead of the merchants. Every minute she spends fighting destroyers is a minute the convoy uses to scatter. And when she destroys us, by then, David, the convoy will be too dispersed to hunt efficiently. Some ships will survive. That's victory. Onslow heeled hard to port as her helm went over, turning toward the enemy at 28 knots. Behind her, destroyers Orwell, Obedient, Obdurate, and Akatz followed in line, their bows digging into heavy seas, spray freezing instantly on their superstructures. Ahead, through gaps in the snow, the German formation grew larger. At 0947 hours, Admiral Hipper opened fire. The first salvo, 4 8-inch shells, fell 200 yards short of Onslow, throwing up geysers of white water that climbed 80 feet before the wind tore them apart. The concussion wave hit the destroyer's bridge like a physical blow. Glass cracked. Metal groaned. Men grabbed stanchions to keep from being thrown off their feet. "Return fire," Sherbrooke ordered. "All guns, rapid fire, target the cruiser." Onslow's forward turrets erupted, 4 4.7-inch guns firing as fast as their crews could load. The shells arced toward Hipper, trailing smoke, impacting against her armored hull and exploding in orange flashes that did no visible damage. 4.7-inch shells couldn't penetrate 6-inch armor, but they could distract, could force the German captain to maneuver, could buy seconds. The second German salvo was closer, 100 yards off Onslow's port beam. The third salvo straddled her, shells landing both sides simultaneously. The fourth salvo hit. An 8-inch shell struck Onslow's forecastle at 0951 hours, penetrating the deck and detonating in the crew quarters below. The explosion killed 17 men instantly, vaporized them, turned them into red mist and fragments of bone. The blast tore a hole in the deck 10 feet across, exposing twisted steel and fires burning below. Sherbrooke felt the hit through his boots, a massive shudder that ran the length of the ship. Damage control reports flooded in over the intercom. Fire in a deck, flooding in forward compartments, casualties heavy. "Maintain course," Sherbrooke ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Maintain fire. Do not break off." Because breaking off meant exposing the convoy, meant letting Hipper past, meant 14 merchant ships destroyed and 800 men dead. A Shate steaming 600 yards astern of Onslow took the next hit at 0958 hours. An 8-inch shell struck her bridge, killing her captain, Lieutenant Commander Arthur Johns, and wounding 12 men. The destroyer, on fire and listing, continued engaging, her surviving officers maintaining formation even as their ship died beneath them. Through the snow and smoke, Sherbrooke could see Akatz burning, orange flames climbing her superstructure, black smoke pouring from her shattered bridge. But her guns were still firing, still buying time. At 10:15 hours, British cruisers HMS Sheffield and Jamaica appeared on radar, racing south from their distant covering position 30 miles north. They'd heard the gunfire, seen the flashes, calculated that the convoy was under attack from surface raiders. German Admiral Kummetz, commanding Hipper, saw them too, and made his own calculation. His orders from Berlin were explicit. Do not risk major units without guaranteed success. Engaging British cruisers meant exposing Hipper to 6-inch gunfire that could cripple her, strand her in Arctic waters far from friendly ports, turn a raid into a disaster. At 10:23 hours, Hipper turned away, laying smoke to cover her withdrawal. The 3 German destroyers followed. The Battle of the Barents Sea was over. Onslow had lost 41 men. Akatz was sinking. But the convoy, all 14 merchant ships, was intact, steaming toward Murmansk, carrying tanks that would reach Stalingrad in 2 weeks. Lieutenant Commander Sherbrooke sat in Onslow's wardroom at 1400 hours, his face black with smoke and cordite, hands wrapped in bandages where flash burns had stripped skin from his palms. Around him, his surviving officers, faces hollow, eyes exhausted, reported damage. "Forward magazine flooded, sir. We've sealed the breach, but we've lost 30% of our ammunition. Engineering reports main engines operational, but fuel consumption is high due to hull damage. Estimate 12 hours steaming at reduced speed before we need refueling. Casualty count, 41 dead, 17 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation." Sherbrooke listened to each report, nodded, asked clarifying questions. Then he said quietly, "What about Aschitz?" Silence. Finally, Kinloch spoke. "She went down at 11:30 hours, sir. HMS Northern Gem recovered 53 survivors from lifeboats. 81 men went into the water. 28 died of hypothermia before rescue arrived." Sherbrooke closed his eyes. 28 men. In water, that was 30 for a degree. Dead in 15 minutes because their ship had positioned itself between the convoy and the enemy, because Lieutenant Commander Johns had held his station until an 8-inch shell killed him, because mathematics said buying 30 minutes required someone to die. Did the convoy make it? All 14 ships accounted for, sir. No losses. They'll reach Murmansk on January 2nd. Sherbrooke opened his eyes. Then we succeeded. At what cost, sir? At the only cost that matters, David. We traded 1 destroyer and 122 casualties for 14 merchant ships carrying 202 tanks. The mathematics are clear, but Kinloch saw something in Sherbrooke's face that contradicted the mathematics. Grief, guilt, the weight of command that turned men's names into statistics and deaths into acceptable losses. On January 3, 1943, convoy JW-51B surviving ships docked in Murmansk. Soviet dock workers, women mostly as the men were at Stalingrad, began unloading immediately. Cranes swung Sherman tanks onto the docks. Trucks hauled crated aircraft toward waiting trains. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, fuel, everything the Red Army needed to hold the line for another month. One of those dock workers, a woman named Katya Sokolova, watched a Sherman tank roll off the SS Kolobre's ramp, its tracks clanking on frozen concrete. Her husband, Senior Sergeant Dmitry Sokolov, was at Stalingrad, fighting in the ruins of the tractor factory with a rifle that jammed every 10 rounds and ammunition rationed to 3 magazines per day. This tank, this specific Sherman, would reach his division in 2 weeks, would support his regiment's counterattack on January 18th, would suppress German machine gun positions long enough for Dmitry to cross open ground and survive. Katya didn't know that. She only knew that these tanks had cost someone's life to deliver, that somewhere in the Arctic, men had died in cold water, so this cargo could arrive. She touched the tank's hull, American steel, cold enough to freeze skin, and whispered, "Spasibo." Thank you. In London, the Admiralty analyzed the Battle of Barents Sea and drew conclusions that would define Arctic operations for the war's remainder. Convoy JW-51B, 14 ships sailed, 14 arrived, 0% merchant losses. Escort losses, 1 destroyer sunk, 1 destroyer damaged, 122 casualties. German losses, 1 destroyer sunk, hipper damaged, operation aborted. Tactical assessment, decisive Allied victory. Convoy protection doctrine validated. The mathematics were precise. Trade destroyers for merchant ships. Trade escort casualties for cargo delivered. Accept losses that hurt but don't cripple in exchange for victories that accumulate. But mathematics couldn't capture what happened in the lifeboat from HMS Aschitz, where 28 men drifted for 18 minutes in 30 first-degree water, their life jackets keeping them afloat but unable to prevent hypothermia from shutting down their organs one by one. Couldn't quantify the last thoughts of able seaman Thomas Wright, 19 years old from Manchester, who died holding his messmate's hand and asking if his mother would be told he'd been brave. Couldn't measure the weight carried by Lieutenant Commander Robert Sherbrooke, who would receive the Victoria Cross for his actions on December 31st, but would wake at utter 300 hours for the rest of his life, seeing Aschitz burning on the horizon and knowing he'd ordered her captain to hold position, even though holding position meant death. On February 12, 1943, Sherbrooke stood on Onslow's quarterdeck in Scapa Flow and watched as Achates' battle ensign, torn, scorched, retrieved from the wreckage, was raised in a memorial ceremony. 81 names read aloud, 81 men who died so 14 ships could live. After the ceremony, a young midshipman approached him, fresh from training, assigned to Onslow as replacement crew. "Sir, I heard you won, that you defeated a German cruiser with just destroyers." Sherbrooke looked at the midshipman's face, at the eagerness and pride and innocence that would be gone after his first action. "We didn't defeat them, son. We survived long enough for them to leave. There's a difference." "But the convoy made it through, sir. All 14 ships." "Yes, they did. Then we won." Sherbrooke thought about Lieutenant Commander Johns dying on Achaides Bridge, about 28 men freezing in lifeboats, about Katya Sokolova in Murmansk, touching a tank's hull and whispering thanks to ghosts she'd never know. "We won," he said quietly. But victory in the Arctic isn't about defeating the enemy. It's about paying the price and accepting that the price will always be too high, and sailing anyway because the alternative is worse. The midshipman didn't understand, but he would. After his first convoy, after watching ships burn and men die, and learning that mathematics could calculate losses but never explain why some men lived while others froze in water that was cold enough to kill. Sherbrooke turned from the memorial and walked back to his ship, carrying the weight of 81 names and the knowledge that more convoys would sail, more escorts would fight, more men would die in Arctic darkness, trading their lives for cargo that might keep the war from being lost. The mathematics demanded it. And mathematics, unlike men, never felt the cold. The radar blip appeared on HMS Belfast's screen at 8:40 hours on December 26, 1943, Boxing Day, though nobody aboard was thinking about Christmas. Lieutenant Commander Richard Sherbrooke, temporarily assigned to the cruiser as tactical observer after recovering from wounds received at Barents Sea, watched the green phosphorescent dot materialize 30 miles southeast and knew immediately what it meant. Scharnhorst, the last German battleship operating in Arctic waters. Contact bearing 135, range 30,000 yards, the radar operator reported, his voice steady despite what the numbers meant. Large surface vessel, speed approximately 25 knots, course north-northwest. Vice Admiral Robert Burnett, commanding Force 1 from Belfast's bridge, studied the tactical plot. Convoy JW-55B, 19 merchant ships carrying 400 tanks and 150 aircraft to Murmansk, was 50 miles north, steaming through Force 8 gales in near total darkness. Scharnhorst was approaching from the south, clearly hunting the convoy. Between them stood 3 British cruisers, Belfast, Norfolk, and Sheffield. The mathematics were brutal. Scharnhorst displaced 32,000 tons, mounted 9 11-inch guns, and could outrun any ship in Burnett's force. The British cruisers' combined displacement 30,000 tons, carried 6-inch and 8-inch guns that would barely scratch Scharnhorst's armor at normal engagement ranges. But Admiral Bruce Fraser, commanding the home fleet aboard HMS Duke of York, 200 miles southwest, had anticipated this, had positioned his battleship, 10 14-inch guns, 42,000 tons, to intercept Scharnhorst if she committed to attacking the convoy. The German battleship was sailing into a trap. She just didn't know it yet. Burnett gave the order that would define the next 12 hours. "All ships, action stations, course to intercept. We're going to bring her to battle." Sherbrooke, standing beside Burnett on the bridge, thought about mathematics, about 3 cruisers against a battleship, about buying time for the convoy to escape, about HMS Estates burning on the horizon 1 year ago, while he'd given the same order: engage the enemy, delay them, die if necessary. "Signal from Duke of York, sir," the communications officer reported. "Admiral Fraser estimates 4 hours until he can reach engagement range. Requests we maintain contact with enemy and prevent him reaching the convoy." 4 hours, Burnett said quietly. "We have to hold her for 4 hours." Sherbrooke did the calculation. 4 hours against Scharnhorst's 11-inch guns. The odds of all 3 cruisers surviving were perhaps 30%. The odds of stopping her from reaching the convoy without Duke of York's support were close to 0. But the convoy had to be protected. That was the only mathematics that mattered. At 0921 hours, HMS Norfolk opened fire at 13,000 yards. The first salvos were ranging shots, 8-inch shells arcing through Arctic darkness, their trajectory marked by the brief orange flash of muzzle fire. Scharnhorst replied immediately, her 11-inch gun sending shells toward Norfolk that fell short, throwing up massive geysers of white water that climbed 100 feet before the wind tore them apart. Sherbrooke stood on Belfast's bridge wing, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching the gun flashes through snow squalls. The temperature was 15 Frödelerf. Wind, force 8, gusting to force 9. Visibility oscillated between 500 yards and complete zero as snow swept across the black water in curtains that erased everything. Perfect conditions for the hunted. Terrible conditions for the hunter. At 09:29 hours, Norfolk scored her first hit, an 8-inch shell that struck Scharnhorst's forward superstructure and destroyed her main fire control radar. The German battleship, suddenly blind in the snowstorm, could no longer accurately track targets beyond visual range. Her gunners were forced to aim at muzzle flashes, made harder because British ships were using flashless propellant that reduced the visible signature of their guns. Admiral Erich Bay, commanding Scharnhorst, made the calculation every naval officer dreaded: continue the attack and risk crippling damage without radar, or break off and return to Norway. He chose survival. At 09:40 hours, Scharnhorst turned south and accelerated to 28 knots, opening the range from Burnett's cruisers. "She's running," Burnett said, watching the radar plot. "Maintain pursuit. Signal Duke of York. Enemy retiring southeast at high speed. Request intercept course." But Scharnhorst was faster than the cruisers. Within 30 minutes, the range had opened to 25,000 yards, beyond effective firing distance. Belfast and her consorts could only shadow, tracking by radar, waiting for Admiral Fraser's battleship to arrive. The chase lasted 7 hours. 7 hours of steaming through darkness and gale-force winds. Radar operators watching the phosphorescent blip that represented 32,000 tons of German steel trying to escape. 7 hours during which Scharnhorst could have broken away, could have used her speed advantage to disappear into the Arctic night. But Bay didn't know about Duke of York. Didn't know that while he ran south, he was running toward a battleship that carried enough firepower to destroy him. At 16:17 hours, HMS Duke of York's Type 273 radar detected Scharnhorst at 45,500 yards. Admiral Fraser ordered battle stations and began maneuvering to bring his full broadside to bear. The trap was closing. At 16:48 hours, HMS Belfast fired star shells, bright phosphorus flares that burst 2,000 feet above the ocean and turned night into harsh white daylight. And there, caught in the artificial light, was Scharnhorst. Massive, dark. Her turrets trained fore and aft because her crew hadn't expected contact. She was 12,000 yards from Duke of York, point-blank range for battleship guns. Duke of York opened fire. The first salvo from Duke of York's 10 14-inch guns hit Scharnhorst 3 times. One shell struck her forward turret, disabling Anton and Bruno guns. Another shell destroyed her aircraft hangar. The third shell penetrated her amidships armor and exploded inside, killing 40 men instantly and starting fires that would burn for the next 2 hours. Scharnhorst returned fire immediately, her surviving 11-inch guns sending shells toward the British battleship. But without radar, firing in darkness, broken only by star shells and muzzle flashes, her accuracy was terrible. Shells fell wide, struck water 200 yards from Duke of York, threw up spray that froze before it hit the sea. The running battle that followed lasted 3 hours and defied every expectation of what naval combat should look like. Scharnhorst, faster than Duke of York, tried to use her speed to escape, but British destroyers HMS Savage, Saumarez, Scorpion, and the Norwegian Stord raced ahead to cut her off, launching torpedo attacks that forced the German battleship to maneuver, to slow down, to expose herself to Duke of York's guns. Sherbrooke, aboard Belfast, watched through binoculars as Scharnhorst fought with the desperation of a cornered animal. Her 11-inch guns fired continuously, even as British shells tore through her superstructure. Her secondary batteries engaged destroyers that closed to 4,000 yards to launch torpedoes. She turned, twisted, tried every tactical maneuver to break free from the trap that was tightening around her. At 17:24 hours, Admiral Bay sent a radio message to German Naval Headquarters. "Am surrounded by heavy units." At 18:20 hours, he sent his final transmission. "We will fight on until the last shell is fired." By 18:30 hours, Scharnhorst was dying. British shells had torn her superstructure apart, destroyed her fire control, killed hundreds of her crew. Fires burned across 3 decks. Her speed had dropped to 20 knots, then 15, then 10 as torpedo hits flooded her engine rooms and jammed her rudder. Destroyers closed in for the kill, launching torpedoes at a target that could barely maneuver. Scorpion fired 8, Stord fired 8, Savage and Saumarez fired 11 more. At least 5 hit, ripping massive holes in Scharnhorst's hull below the waterline. At 19:15 hours, Belfast fired her last torpedoes at 4,000 yards range. Before they reached the target, Scharnhorst's radar blip disappeared from the screen. Sonar operators heard a series of muffled underwater explosions, her magazines detonating as she rolled over. At 19:45 hours on December 26, 1943, the battleship Scharnhorst capsized and sank in 900 feet of water 72 miles north of North Cape, Norway. 927 men went down with her. The water temperature was 29 degrees. HMS Savage, Saumarez, and Scorpion raced toward the sinking site, searchlights cutting through darkness and snow, sweeping across black water where hundreds of German sailors floated in life jackets, screaming for rescue. Sherbrooke stood on Belfast's bridge wing and listened to those screams carry across the water, high-pitched, desperate, fading as hypothermia shut down their bodies. He'd heard those screams before when HMS Akats sank and 28 men died waiting for rescue. The language was different. The sound was the same. British destroyers threw lines overboard, pulled men from water that killed in 8 minutes. German sailors, many of them burned, some missing limbs from shell fragments, clung to ropes with hands that no longer responded to commands. Rescue crews hauled them aboard, stripped off frozen clothing, wrapped them in blankets, forced hot tea down their throats. They saved 36. Out of 1,968 officers and men aboard Scharnhorst, 36 survived. The rest died in the water, their cries fading into silence as the Arctic killed them. Neither Rear Admiral Bay nor Captain Hintze were among those rescued, though both were reported seen in the water after the ship sank. No officers survived. Only 36 ratings pulled from the sea in the first 15 minutes before hypothermia made rescue futile. British casualties: 21 killed, 11 wounded. Most died aboard HMS Saumarez, hit by Scharnhorst's secondary batteries while closing for torpedo attack. Sherbrooke watched destroyers pull away from the sinking site, their searchlights extinguished, leaving 1,900 bodies floating in darkness. The mathematics were clear: 36 saved versus 1,027 lost. But mathematics couldn't quantify the sound of men dying in water cold enough to kill, couldn't measure the weight of listening to screams fade into silence because rescue ships had to withdraw before U-boats arrived. Admiral Fraser signaled the Admiralty at 2015 hours. Scharnhorst sunk. The reply came immediately: "Grand, well done." Convoy JW-55B reached Murmansk on January 3, 1944. All 19 merchant ships intact, 400 tanks delivered, 150 aircraft delivered, 0 losses. The mathematics said the battle was a decisive victory. Sherbrooke standing on Belfast's deck as they steamed toward Murmansk, listening to the ship's company celebrate, thought about 1,627 German sailors freezing in Arctic water and wondered what victory was supposed to feel like. In May 1945, convoy RA-67, the last Arctic convoy of the war, sailed from Murmansk carrying empty cargo holds and crews who thought they'd survived. Germany had surrendered on May 7th. The war was over. The killing was supposed to stop. Merchant seaman James Mitchell, 22 years old, stood on the deck of SS Avondale Park at 2200 hours on May 7th and watched the sunset that barely touched the horizon before rising again. His stepfather, Lieutenant Commander Arthur Johns, had died on HMS Acatus in December 1942, killed when an 8-inch shell from Admiral Hipper struck the bridge. James had joined the Merchant Marine in 1943, wanting to honor the man who'd raised him by serving on the same route. He'd made 4 Arctic runs, survived 3 U-boat attacks, 2 bomber strikes, and 1 Force 10 gale that had torn lifeboats off their davits. Now, with the war over, he was going home to Portsmouth, to his mother Sarah, to a life that didn't include watching ships burn and men die in water cold enough to kill. At 22:15 hours, German Ju-88 bombers appeared from the south, crews that either hadn't received surrender orders or refused to acknowledge them. They attacked RA-67 in the Barents Sea, dropping bombs from 8,000 feet. The first bomb missed Avondale Park by 50 yards. The second hit her engine room. James Mitchell was on deck when the explosion tore through 3 decks and killed 23 men instantly. The blast wave threw him against a bulkhead, cracked 3 ribs, left him gasping. Around him, the ship was dying, fires spreading, steam escaping from ruptured lines, the deck tilting as water flooded the engine spaces. "Abandoned ship!" someone screamed. James made it to lifeboat station number 2 before the deck tilted too steeply to lower boats. He went over the side with 14 other men, hitting water that was 34 Celsius, cold enough to paralyze muscles in 5 minutes, kill in 15. The shock drove air from his lungs. His body convulsed, trying to generate heat that couldn't be generated. His fingers, locked around a piece of wreckage, stopped responding to commands. He tried to swim toward other survivors, but his arms wouldn't move. He thought about his stepfather dying on Akaida's bridge, thought about his mother waiting in Portsmouth, thought about how the war was over, how he was supposed to survive, how the mathematics had promised he'd make it home. At 8 minutes, his vision began to narrow. At 12 minutes, he stopped feeling cold. At 14 minutes, his heart, starved of oxygen, core temperature dropped below viable levels, stopped beating. HMS Lark arrived 20 minutes later, rescued 8 men, found 15 bodies floating in life jackets, faces blue, eyes open, mouths frozen in silent screams. James Mitchell's body was recovered on May 10, 1945, floating 40 miles north of the Kola Peninsula. He was the last Allied casualty of the Arctic convoys. The war had ended 36 hours before he died. The telegram arrived at Sarah Mitchell's home in Portsmouth on May 8, 1945, VE Day. She was 47 years old, a widow since 1942, and she knew what the telegram said before opening it. Had known since waking that morning with the certainty that comes from losing too much. She sat at her kitchen table and read the words that said her son was dead, that he'd drowned 36 hours after the war ended, that the Arctic had taken him the way it had taken his stepfather. Outside, Portsmouth was celebrating, church bells ringing, people dancing in the streets, bonfires being lit. Victory. The war was over. 6 years of killing had ended. Families reunited, soldiers coming home. But her son was at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, and victory sounded like a word in a language she'd never learned. She thought about Arthur dying on a Kates while protecting a convoy, about James dying on Avondale Park when the war was already over, about the mathematics that said their deaths bought Soviet tanks and British victory and the defeat of Nazi Germany. Thought about whether that made their deaths meaningful or just tragic. Decided it had to be both, because the alternative, accepting they'd died for nothing, was unbearable. On June 15, 1945, the Soviet Union held a ceremony in Murmansk honoring the Arctic convoys. British and American sailors attended. Survivors who'd made the run 5 times, 10 times, lived through torpedo attacks and bomber strikes and storms that tore ships apart. Commander Richard Sherbrooke attended, wearing his Victoria Cross, standing through speeches about Allied Soviet friendship and supplies that sustained the Red Army. When a Soviet general thanked the Royal Navy for delivering 7,000 aircraft and 5,000 tanks, Sherbrooke thought about HMS Aschatz burning, about Scharnhorst's crew screaming in Arctic water, about 3,000 Allied sailors dead and 1,927 German sailors dead, and mathematics that said all those deaths added up to victory. After the ceremony, a Soviet woman approached him, weathered face, calloused hands, eyes that had seen too much. She spoke broken English, but her meaning was clear. "My husband Stalingrad, tank you bring, save his life. He come home because you." Sherbrooke nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Because this was the only mathematics that mattered. Dmitry Sokolov alive because Arthur Johns died, because James Mitchell died, because 3,000 men froze in water cold enough to kill so Soviet soldiers could have tanks. "Thank you," the woman said, crying. "Thank you." Sherbrooke thought about telling her the cost. About Aschatz and Avondale Park and Scharnhorst. About boys who never reached 25. About Sarah Mitchell in Portsmouth, who'd lost husband and son to the same Arctic that had saved this woman's husband. He was worth it, Sherbrooke said quietly, and meant it, because the alternative was believing the deaths were meaningless. Sarah Mitchell never attended a memorial ceremony, never accepted medals awarded posthumously to her husband and son, never spoke publicly about the Arctic convoys or the war or what victory had cost her family. She worked at Portsmouth Naval Hospital for 28 years, caring for sailors, because it was the only way she could honor the men she'd lost. She died in 1973, having never remarried, and was buried between her first husband, James's father, killed in World War I, and the memorial stone for Arthur Johns and James Mitchell, whose bodies remained in Arctic water. The headstone read, Lieutenant Commander Arthur Johns, HMS Achates, 31st December 1942, Merchant Seaman James Mitchell, SS Avondale Park, 7 May 1945, lost in Arctic waters not forgotten. 78 convoys sailed between 1941 and 1945. 4 million tons delivered, 104 merchant ships lost, 16 warships lost, 3,000 dead. Those numbers were carved in stone at memorials in Liverpool and Murmansk. But some mathematics couldn't be carved. The mathematics of Sarah Mitchell losing 2 men to the same ocean, of Dmitry Sokolov living to 87 because Sherman tanks reached Stalingrad, of cause and effect stretching across continents and decades, connecting lives that never met, but were bound by decisions made in Arctic darkness. The equation balanced, the cargo delivered. The war was won, but the cost was paid in names on headstones and memories carried by survivors who learned that victory and grief could coexist, that mathematics could calculate losses but never explain why some men died while others lived, that the Arctic remembered them all, the sailors and the soldiers, the living and the dead, the victories and the sacrifices. The cold remained, the darkness endured, and 3,000 men who died in water that killed in minutes had saved a world they never saw. That was the only mathematics that mattered in the end.